February 23, 1945, Prinz-Albrecht-Straße 8, Berlin. The basement of the Reich security main office held 37 interrogation rooms, each numbered with brass plates that had been polished so frequently the numerals were beginning to wear thin. Room 22 measured 4 meters by 3, with walls painted a grey that seemed designed to exist at the edge of perception. Neither light nor dark, neither warm nor cool, a colour that offered no comfort and no focus, that made the eyes slide away searching for something, anything to anchor themselves to. A table, 2 chairs, a bulb hanging from a cloth-wrapped cord. In the corner, a drain in the floor that had been installed for reasons no one discussed but everyone understood. The room smelled of disinfectant layered over something organic and wrong, a smell that no amount of carbolic acid could entirely eliminate. It was 0300 hours. A woman sat in one of the chairs. Her name was Marie Dubois, 26 years old, a wireless operator for the French resistance captured in Lyons 3 weeks earlier. She had been interrogated 5 times already. She had revealed nothing of operational value, only her name, her cover identity, information her interrogators already possessed. And so they had moved to a different technique, one that Hauptsturmführer Otto Brenner would describe 36 years later with the clinical precision of a man explaining a manufacturing process, sitting in a cafe in São Paulo, speaking into a tape recorder held by a French journalist named Claire Fontaine, who had spent 3 years tracking him down. The physical methods, Brenner said in German that still carried the crisp authority of his SS training, were effective for some subjects, but they had limitations. Pain produces noise, screaming, begging, eventually lies told simply to make the pain stop. And pain can create martyrs. A subject who is beaten becomes, in her own mind, a victim of obvious injustice. This can strengthen resistance rather than break it. So we developed other methods, methods that left no marks, methods that attacked not the body but the identity, the self-conception, the psychological architecture that allowed resistance in the first place. For female subjects in particular, we found that verbal techniques, systematic mockery, humiliation, the dismantling of dignity through language, these were often more effective than physical torture. We could make a woman stop speaking not by damaging her vocal cords, but by making her believe that her voice had no value, that anything she said would be turned against her, that silence was her only remaining form of control. The interview Fontaine conducted with Brenner in 1981 was part of her research for a book on the treatment of female resistance fighters in Nazi custody. Brenner had been a specialist interrogator with the Gestapo, trained at the SS security school in Berlin-Charlottenburg, assigned to cases involving foreign intelligence, operatives and resistance networks. He had interrogated dozens of women between 1943 and 1945. After the war, he had escaped to Argentina under a false identity, eventually settling in Brazil. Fontaine found him through a network of Nazi hunters and researchers, approaching him with an offer, speak openly about his methods, and she would not reveal his location to authorities. Brenner, now 74 and perhaps seeking some form of legacy or justification, agreed. What he described over 6 hours of recorded interviews was a systematic psychological warfare campaign designed specifically to silence women who possessed information the Reich needed, not by extracting that information through violence, but by destroying the prisoner's belief in her own right and capacity to speak at all. The Third Reich's interrogation apparatus was vast and bureaucratic, encompassing multiple overlapping agencies. The Gestapo, secret state police, handled political prisoners and resistance fighters. The Abwehr, military intelligence, interrogated captured military personnel and spies. The SD, security service, focused on ideological enemies and intelligence gathering. The Kripo, criminal police, dealt with ordinary criminal matters that sometimes intersected with political cases. Despite jurisdictional conflicts, these agencies shared training facilities, methodologies, and an understanding that interrogation was both science and art, a technical skill that could be learned, refined, and passed on through institutional knowledge. By 1944, the number of female prisoners passing through interrogation facilities had increased dramatically. These women came from across occupied Europe: French resistance operatives, Polish underground fighters, Soviet intelligence officers, British SOE agents, Yugoslav partisans, Dutch and Belgian saboteurs, German political dissidents. They had been trained in varying degrees to resist interrogation. They knew to give only name, cover story, and minimal information. They expected physical torture. Most had been briefed on what to anticipate and had mentally prepared for it. What many were not prepared for was the verbal warfare that interrogators like Brenner had perfected, a technique that used language itself as a weapon to systematically dismantle the prisoner's sense of self, credibility, and worth, until speaking became psychologically impossible. Brenner described the technique as progressing through distinct phases, each designed to attack a different aspect of the prisoner's identity, and each building on the psychological damage of the previous phase. The first phase was what he called definitional mockery, the systematic denial of the prisoner's self-identification and the imposition of degrading alternative definitions. When a female prisoner was brought to interrogation, Brenner explained, she typically attempted to assert identity and status. She might say, "I am Lieutenant so-and-so of the British Army," or "I am a civilian arrested by mistake," or "I am a member of the resistance." Whatever identity she claimed, we immediately rejected it through mockery. If she claimed military rank, we laughed. "You, a lieutenant? You're a terrorist, a criminal, a woman playing dress-up in a soldier's uniform." If she claimed civilian status, we mocked that too. A civilian who just happened to be carrying explosives, a civilian who speaks 4 languages and operates a wireless transmitter, you insult our intelligence. The purpose was to establish from the first moment that we did not accept her definition of herself, that we would impose our definition on her, and that her attempts to assert identity would be met with ridicule. This opening gambit set the tone for everything that followed. By refusing to acknowledge the prisoner's self-identification, by responding to her attempts to assert identity with laughter and scorn, the interrogator established a psychological dynamic where the prisoner's words were treated as inherently ridiculous, where her speech was evidence not of agency, but of delusion or deceit. The mockery communicated a message. Your voice has no authority here. Your words mean nothing. You exist only as we define you. The second phase was what Brenner termed biographical deconstruction. The interrogator would claim to know the prisoner's history and would recount that history in ways designed to humiliate, focusing on elements that challenge the prisoner's self-conception as a capable, respected professional. We had files on many of these women, Brenner said. Intelligence reports, background investigations, information from informants. We knew about their families, their education, their personal lives, and we would use this information to create humiliating narratives. For example, if a woman presented herself as a dedicated resistance fighter, we might say, "We know why you really joined the resistance. You were trying to impress a man, your handler, your commanding officer. You were sleeping with him, weren't you? You thought that by playing at being a spy you could keep his attention." Or if she was educated, we might mock that. "Look at the university graduate, the intellectual, so easy to capture. All those books and you couldn't even construct a decent cover story." The goal was to reframe her entire biography as a story of incompetence, vanity, sexual motivation, or naivete. To make her doubt her own narrative of who she was and why she had taken the risks she took. The mockery was not random or spontaneous. It was carefully calibrated based on psychological profiles that interrogators developed through observation and questioning. Brenner and his colleagues were trained to identify what prisoners took pride in, their intelligence, their courage, their loyalty, their professional competence, and to systematically attack precisely those elements. A woman who took pride in her education was mocked as an overeducated fool. A woman who took pride in her courage was mocked as reckless and suicidal. A woman who took pride in her loyalty was mocked as a dupe manipulated by cynical handlers who cared nothing for her. "We looked for the foundation of their self-respect," Brenner explained with the detachment of a craftsman describing his tools. "And we demolished it. If a woman believed she was brave, we called her stupid. If she believed she was intelligent, we called her gullible. If she believed she was serving a noble cause, we called her a pawn in someone else's game. We wanted her to question everything she believed about herself. Because a person who doubts her own competence, her own judgment, her own worth, that person begins to doubt whether she has the right to withhold information, whether her resistance is justified, whether anything she says or does matters." The third phase was gender-based humiliation, the systematic use of sexist mockery to attack the prisoner's identity as a woman and her credibility as a professional. This phase exploited the cultural tensions that existed around women's participation in military and intelligence operations. In the 1940s, women in combat-adjacent roles were transgressing powerful social norms. They faced skepticism and hostility even within their own organizations. Interrogators weaponized these cultural anxieties, using them to make female prisoners doubt their own legitimacy and worth. Women in intelligence and resistance work were already fighting for respect in their own organizations, Brenner noted. Many of them had experienced condescension from male colleagues, questions about their capabilities, assumptions that they were less competent or more emotional than men. We exploited this. We would say things like, "Did your commanders really trust you with important information? Or did they just give you busy work to keep you feeling included?" Or, "We know women can't keep secrets. You're too emotional, too talkative. That's why your network was so easy to penetrate." Or, "Your male colleagues are probably relieved you were captured. Now they don't have to pretend to take you seriously anymore." The mockery often became explicitly sexual, designed to reduce the prisoner from a professional agent to a sexual object, and to suggest that her role in the resistance was fundamentally about sexuality rather than competence. Interrogators would speculate about the prisoner's sexual relationships with male colleagues, suggest that she had used sexuality to advance her position, or mock her appearance and attractiveness. The message was multifaceted, that women's value was fundamentally sexual, that any professional accomplishment was really about sexual manipulation, and that a woman who was captured had proven herself incompetent and therefore worthless in every dimension, including the sexual. "If a woman was attractive, we would mock her for it," Brenner said. "You think your looks make you special? You think batting your eyes at your handler made you valuable? You're here now. Your looks didn't protect you." If she was not conventionally attractive, we mocked that too. No wonder you joined the resistance. It was the only place where men might pay attention to you, and even they didn't value you enough to properly train you or protect you from capture. It was a double bind. Whatever her appearance, whatever her sexuality or lack of it, we used it to humiliate her. The goal was to make her feel that as a woman, she had no place in intelligence work, that her presence was inherently ridiculous, and that her capture proved the folly of women attempting men's work. The fourth phase was what Brenner called isolation through mockery, using ridicule to convince the prisoner that she had been abandoned by her organization, that no one was coming to help her, that her resistance served no purpose because no one valued her enough to warrant that sacrifice. Interrogators would claim that the prisoner's organization had already written her off, that her capture had been anticipated or even deliberately arranged, that her colleagues were laughing at her naivete. We would tell her, "Your network has already been rolled up. Everyone you knew has been arrested or has fled. The mission you thought was so important. It failed days ago. Your handlers in London know you're captured, and they've done nothing. They're not negotiating for you. They're not mounting a rescue. They've moved on. You're forgotten. You're sitting here protecting information that's already obsolete, suffering for people who don't even think about you anymore." Whether this was true or not didn't matter. The point was to make her feel utterly alone, to convince her that her resistance was pointless because she had already been discarded. This phase often incorporated mockery of the prisoner's patriotism or ideological commitment. Interrogators would laugh at the idea that the prisoner's nation or cause cared about her individual fate. France doesn't care about you. Britain doesn't care about you. You're one small pawn in a vast game, and pawns are sacrificed without thought. The generals and politicians who sent you here are safe in their offices drinking wine, planning their next operations with other pawns. And you're sitting in this basement alone, suffering for abstractions that will forget you the moment you die. The cumulative effect of these four phases, definitional mockery, biographical deconstruction, gender-based humiliation, and isolation through mockery, was to systematically destroy the prisoner's belief in her own credibility, competence, value, and support. Each time she spoke, her words were met with laughter, scorn, or dismissive reinterpretation. Each attempt to assert identity or maintain dignity was treated as evidence of delusional stupidity. Each silence was praised as the first sign of sense she'd shown. The psychological message became overwhelming. Speaking makes you vulnerable to further mockery. Silence is the only way to protect what little dignity remains. After several sessions of this treatment, Brenner said, many female prisoners simply stopped speaking, not because we'd beaten them, not because we'd tortured them physically, but because we'd convinced them that speaking was pointless, that anything they said would be twisted and used against them, that their voice had no power, no authority, no value. They would sit in the interrogation room and say nothing. They would look at the floor or the wall. They would not respond to questions, not even to give name and cover story. They had internalized the mockery. They had accepted our definition of them as worthless, ridiculous, incompetent. And in that acceptance, they became psychologically paralyzed. The silence was a form of psychological surrender. But the silence was also, in some cases, a form of resistance, though not the form Brenner recognized. For women who understood that any speech would be weaponized against them, that the interrogation was designed not to extract information, but to destroy identity, silence became the last bastion of control. If they could not prevent the mockery, they could at least deny the interrogator the material for new mockery. If they could not maintain their public identity, they could at least preserve their internal sense of self by refusing to expose it to further degradation. The silence was strategic, protective, an acknowledgement that speech in this context was dangerous and that survival required withdrawal. Marie Dubois survived her interrogation and her subsequent imprisonment at Ravensbrück. She was liberated by Soviet forces in April 1945, weighing 38 kilograms, barely able to walk. In her post-war testimony to French intelligence, she described the interrogations at Prinz-Albrecht-Straße with devastating clarity. "They never beat me," she stated, "not once, but they destroyed me with words. Every interrogation session was 3 or 4 hours of mockery. They laughed at everything I said. They twisted my words. They called me stupid, ugly, deluded, worthless. They said I was a joke, that the resistance was embarrassed by me, that I had been sent on a suicide mission because I was expendable. After the first week I stopped responding. I stopped speaking. Not because I believed them. I knew they were trying to break me. But because every time I spoke they found new ways to hurt me with my own words. Silence was the only defense I had left. So I sat through the interrogation saying nothing. And the strange thing was, the silence drove them crazy. They wanted me to speak so they could mock me. When I wouldn't give them that, when I just sat there, they didn't know what to do. The mockery doesn't work if you don't speak. So in the end, my silence became my resistance. Other survivors described similar experiences. The mockery was so systematic, so relentless, so specifically designed to exploit every vulnerability, that speech became unbearable. Some women described it as worse than physical torture. Beatings ended, but the interrogator's voice, the mocking tone, the humiliating words, these echoed in memory for decades. They described hearing the interrogator's voice in their own heads long after liberation, a colonizing presence that had been deliberately implanted and that proved extraordinarily difficult to excise. Dr. Judith Kestenberg, a psychoanalyst who treated Holocaust survivors and resistance fighters in the 1950s and 1960s, documented what she termed voice trauma, psychological damage specifically related to verbal abuse in interrogation contexts. The patients I saw who had been subjected to systematic mockery during interrogation showed distinct patterns, she wrote in a 1969 paper. They had difficulty speaking about their experiences. They showed extreme sensitivity to criticism or laughter. They had internalized the interrogator's voice to such a degree that it became an aspect of their own self-talk, constantly undermining, mocking, questioning their own perceptions and worth. Some developed selective mutism in contexts that resembled the interrogation, authority figures, official interviews, situations where they might be judged. The verbal abuse had created a profound association. Speaking equals vulnerability to mockery. Therefore, safety requires silence. The long-term effects of mockery-based interrogation were in many ways more debilitating than the effects of physical torture. Physical wounds healed. Physical pain, however terrible in the moment, ended. But the psychological wounds left by systematic mockery, the internalized voice of the interrogator, the damaged sense of self-worth, the fear of speaking, these persisted. Many survivors described decades of difficulty with self-advocacy, with asserting themselves in professional or personal contexts, with trusting that their voices had value. They had been taught, through hundreds of hours of carefully calibrated mockery, that speaking made them vulnerable, that their words had no power, that silence was safer. That lesson proved extraordinarily difficult to unlearn. The German war crimes trials after 1945 rarely addressed psychological torture of the kind Brenner described. The focus was on physical atrocities, concentration camp murders, execution of prisoners, medical experiments, verbal abuse, mockery, psychological manipulation. These were difficult to prosecute. They left no physical evidence. They required testimony about subjective experiences of humiliation and psychological damage, and there was little legal framework for understanding them as crimes. The Geneva Convention prohibited torture and inhuman treatment, but was vague about whether psychological abuse qualified. International law recognized physical torture, but had not yet developed sophisticated understandings of psychological torture as equally damaging. Brenner was never prosecuted for his activities. He was briefly detained by American forces after the war, but was released when no evidence of physical torture could be found. His file noted that he was an interrogator, but provided no detail about his methods. He disappeared into the rat lines that smuggled Nazi officials to South America, living under an assumed name for decades. When Fontaine found him in 1981, he was living comfortably on a pension from his work as a translator. He felt no need to hide because he believed, correctly, that what he had done was not considered serious enough to warrant continued prosecution efforts. "I broke no laws," he told Fontaine. "I tortured no one, not in the legal sense. I used words, psychology. I was trained by professionals who had studied the mind, who understood how to dismantle resistance without leaving marks. This was considered sophisticated, scientific. We were proud of it. We saw ourselves as more civilized than the interrogators, who relied on crude physical methods. We were effective without being barbaric, or so we told ourselves." When Fontaine pressed him on whether he felt the mockery was a form of torture, Brenner became defensive. "Torture is physical, pain, injury. What I did was psychological pressure. Uncomfortable, yes. Unpleasant, but not torture. The women I interrogated were not beaten, not starved, not mutilated. I spoke to them. I challenged their narratives. I used their own insecurities against them. Is that torture, or is it simply skilled interrogation? Where do you draw the line?" This question, where to draw the line between enhanced interrogation and torture, between psychological pressure and psychological destruction, has haunted discussions of interrogation ethics for decades. The techniques Brenner described have appeared in multiple contexts: CIA interrogations during the Cold War, British interrogation of IRA suspects, American interrogations in the War on Terror. The language changes, enhanced interrogation techniques, psychological pressure, ego-down approaches. But the fundamental methods remain: systematic verbal humiliation designed to destroy the subject's sense of self-worth and render them psychologically incapable of resistance. The survivors of such techniques have consistently testified that they are indeed torture. The absence of physical pain does not make the suffering less real or less damaging. The fact that it leaves no visible scars does not mean it leaves no scars. The psychological wounds, the damaged sense of self, the internalized voice of the abuser, the fear of speaking, the difficulty trusting one's own perceptions, these are as real and as debilitating as physical injuries, sometimes more so because they are invisible and therefore often go unrecognized and untreated. International law has gradually evolved to recognize psychological torture as a distinct category of abuse. The UN Convention Against Torture, adopted in 1984, defines torture to include acts causing severe pain or suffering, whether physical or mental. The Rome Statute of the International Criminal Court recognizes psychological torture as a war crime, but implementation remains inconsistent, and perpetrators of psychological torture are rarely prosecuted with the same vigor as perpetrators of physical torture. Brenner's testimony to Fontaine was published in her 1983 book, Voices Silenced: Verbal Torture of Female Resistance Fighters in Nazi Interrogation. The book was controversial. Some critics argued that Fontaine had given platform to a war criminal, allowing him to justify his actions. Others noted that the agreement not to reveal his location had allowed him to escape justice. But many historians and psychologists recognized the value of the testimony, not for Brenner's self-serving interpretations, but for the detailed description of methods that survivors had been describing for decades, but which had been dismissed or minimized because they left no physical evidence. the book contributed to growing recognition of psychological torture as a serious human rights violation. It was cited in legal briefs, in medical literature, in training materials for human rights investigators. It helped establish that systematic mockery and verbal humiliation could constitute torture under international law, that the absence of physical violence did not mean the absence of serious abuse, and that the suffering of women who had been subjected to these techniques deserved recognition and redress. The symbol that appears most frequently in survivors' accounts of mockery-based interrogation is the echo, the way the interrogator's voice persisted long after the interrogation ended, reverberating in memory and in the survivor's own self-talk. Women described hearing the interrogator's mocking tone when they looked in mirrors, when they made mistakes, when they attempted to speak in public. The voice had become internalized, an uninvited presence that questioned their worth, mocked their efforts, undermined their confidence. The worst part, wrote Hélène Rousseau, a French resistance fighter who survived Gestapo interrogation, was that the voice became my voice. I would think something, and immediately I would hear the interrogator's mockery. "Who do you think you are? You're ridiculous. You're worthless." For years after liberation, I couldn't speak in public without hearing his laughter in my head. I couldn't assert myself without his voice telling me I was deluded, incompetent, stupid. He had planted that voice in me so successfully that it became autonomous. It didn't need him to be present. It operated on its own, sabotaging my attempts to rebuild my life. Therapy helped, eventually. But it took years, decades to quiet that voice, to separate it from my own thoughts, to recognize it as an artifact of torture rather than truth about myself. This internalized voice, the echo of systematic mockery, became one of the defining characteristics of psychological torture. It demonstrated that the goal of mockery-based interrogation was not merely to extract information in the moment, but to permanently damage the prisoner's psychological functioning. The interrogator's voice was designed to persist, to become a permanent presence that would sabotage the survivor's attempts to speak, to assert herself, to claim authority or value. It was a form of psychological colonization, an implantation of the abuser's perspective into the victim's own mind, where it would continue the work of degradation long after the interrogation ended. The difficulty of removing this internalized voice, the years of therapy required, the ongoing struggle to distinguish between the interrogator's mockery and one's own legitimate self-assessment, testified to the profound and lasting damage that verbal torture inflicted. It was not merely uncomfortable, as Brenner claimed. It was a systematic assault on identity that left survivors struggling for decades to reclaim their voices, to believe in their own worth, to speak without hearing the echo of mockery that had been deliberately implanted to silence them. Otto Brenner died in 1989, 8 years after his interview with Fontaine. He never faced prosecution for his activities. He never expressed remorse. In his final years, according to a brief obituary in a German-language Brazilian newspaper, he worked as a translator and lived quietly, apparently untroubled by his past. His testimony remains in archives, a detailed confession of methods that caused profound suffering to dozens of women and contributed to the broader system of Nazi terror. But there is no justice in that archive, only evidence, only the record of what was done and what was never punished. The women he interrogated, those who survived, carried different legacies. Some became advocates for human rights and psychological trauma recognition. Some remained silent about their experiences for decades, unable or unwilling to speak about what had been done to them. Some found ways to reclaim their voices through writing, through testimony, through activism. Some never fully recovered the ability to speak with confidence, their voices permanently shadowed by the mockery they had endured. Marie Dubois lived until 2004. In her later years, she worked with an organization that provided psychological support to survivors of torture. She spoke publicly about her experiences, including the mockery-based interrogation at Prinz-Albrecht-Straße. "I want people to understand," she said in a 1995 interview, "that torture doesn't require pliers and electricity. It can be done with words, with laughter, with the systematic message delivered hour after hour, day after day, that you are worthless, that your voice doesn't matter, that speaking makes you vulnerable to further humiliation. That kind of torture leaves no scars you can photograph, but it leaves scars nonetheless, deep scars that shape the rest of your life." She also spoke about resistance. When I stopped speaking during the interrogations, the Gestapo assumed they had broken me, and in some ways they had. They had made speech unbearable, but my silence was also defiance. It was the only form of control I still had. I couldn't stop them from mocking me, but I could deny them the satisfaction of fresh material. I could withdraw to a place inside myself where their words couldn't fully reach. That interior space, that's what I was protecting when I went silent. Not information, really. The information I had was limited and already compromised. I was protecting my sense of self, my knowledge that I was not what they said I was, my belief that someday, when this was over, I would speak again, and I would be heard. That determination to preserve the self through strategic silence, to wait for a time when speech would be possible without being weaponized, to maintain faith that the voice would someday be reclaimed, was perhaps the deepest form of resistance available to women subjected to mockery-based interrogation. They could not prevent the mockery. They could not escape the interrogation, but they could refuse to cooperate in their own psychological destruction. They could choose silence not as surrender but as protection, as a bet on future possibility, as an acknowledgement that some contexts are too toxic for speech, and that survival requires knowing when to speak and when to withdraw. The legacy of mockery-based interrogation extends far beyond the specific historical context of Nazi Germany. The techniques Brenner described have reappeared in multiple conflicts and contexts because they are effective at achieving certain goals, breaking resistance, inducing psychological paralysis, avoiding the physical evidence that makes torture prosecutable. They persist because they operate in a legal and moral grey zone where perpetrators can claim they are not really torturing, just applying psychological pressure, just using enhanced interrogation, just doing what's necessary to protect national security. But the survivor's testimony is clear. Systematic mockery designed to silence is torture. It causes profound suffering. It inflicts lasting damage. It violates human dignity in fundamental ways. And the fact that it leaves no physical scars does not make it less serious or less deserving of legal and moral condemnation. If anything, the invisibility of the wounds makes the crime more insidious, harder to detect and prosecute, more likely to be minimized or dismissed. The women, who were mocked until they stopped speaking, carried forward a witness against that dismissal. Their testimony, in debriefings and trials, in memoirs and interviews, in therapy sessions and advocacy work, insisted that their suffering was real, that the mockery was torture, that the silence was a wound. They refused to let the invisibility of psychological damage become an excuse for denial. They named what had been done to them. They described the mechanisms and effects. They demanded recognition and accountability. And gradually, over decades, the framework of international law and psychological understanding expanded to encompass their experiences. Psychological torture is now recognized as a distinct category of abuse. Verbal humiliation and systematic mockery are understood as potentially devastating. The long-term effects of psychological torture are documented in medical and psychiatric literature. The legal protections have been strengthened, the definitions clarified, the obligations to prosecute and prevent made more explicit. But the gap between law and practice remains vast. Psychological torture continues. Mockery-based interrogation persists. Women in custody, whether as prisoners of war, as criminal suspects, as immigration detainees, continue to face verbal abuse designed to degrade and silence. And the perpetrators continue to claim, as Brenner did, that they are not really torturing, that they are simply using words, that the damage is not their responsibility because it is psychological rather than physical. Against that persistent denial, the testimony of survivors stands as irrefutable evidence. The mockery was real, the suffering was profound, the silence was not consent but destruction, and the voices that were silenced through systematic verbal abuse carry forward a demand that we recognize psychological torture for what it is, that we hold perpetrators accountable regardless of whether they left physical scars, and that we create legal and institutional frameworks that protect the fundamental right to speak without being subjected to degradation, designed to make speech psychologically impossible. The grey walls of Room 22 at Prinz-Albrecht-Straße were destroyed by Allied bombing in 1945. The building was eventually demolished, the site left vacant for decades as a kind of accidental memorial to the suffering that occurred there. Now it houses the Topography of Terror Documentation Centre, where visitors can learn about the Nazi security apparatus and the crimes it committed. The exhibits document physical atrocities in detail. The psychological torture receives less attention. It is harder to display, harder to make visceral for visitors who have not experienced it. But in the archives accessible to researchers, in the oral history collections, in the memoirs and testimony of survivors, the evidence is overwhelming. Women were mocked systematically, relentlessly, with professional expertise, until many stopped speaking. The mockery was designed to silence, it was torture, and the voices that were silenced are speaking now, through the historical record, through the frameworks of law and psychology they helped create, through the ongoing insistence that psychological violence is real violence, that verbal abuse is real abuse, and that the suffering inflicted through words deserves recognition, condemnation, and the full weight of justice that has for too long been withheld. The grammar of silence that Otto Brenner and his colleagues created, the systematic verbal techniques that made speech unbearable, has been documented, analysed, and condemned. And against that grammar stands another, the grammar of testimony, of witness, of voices reclaimed from silence, insisting on being heard, demanding that we understand what was done and commit to ensuring it never happens again. That is the legacy that survivors have built. That is the testimony that echoes forward, louder with each generation, impossible now to silence or dismiss.